Those of you who work for a church, ministry, or charity are typically full of passion and feel called to serve them. You also know that they need strategic leadership to make an impact. Redeemer University's new online, not-for-profit management certificate is designed for busy working professionals, helping you develop stronger skills in strategy, fundraising, planning, HR, marketing, and more. Learn more and apply today for the online, not-for-profit management certificate program at redeemer.ca/NFP. That's redeemer.ca/NFP. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into Real Talk. Appreciate you joining me for this conversation with Dr. Neil Shenvi. A much anticipated episode on my part. I'm really looking forward to sharing this episode, this conversation with you, and starting a discussion about critical theory. We've done a bit of this on this podcast, talking about this issue and social justice ideology in general, but never probably so academically or so directly as in this conversation. So really excited to share this with you guys. Neil Shenvi got a doctorate from UC Berkeley in theoretical chemistry, but while he was there, he became a Christian and took a real interest in Christian apologetics. And with the goal of interacting with his peers, his secular peers at UC Berkeley, wrote a book called Why Believe, which is a fairly rational and academic book to Christian apologetics. But afterward became interested in social issues while actually homeschooling his kids. Dr. Shenvi co-authored a book with Pat Sawyer called Critical Dilemma, dealing with the rise of critical race theory, critical theories, and social justice ideology, but more specifically how it impacts our society and the church and how we can deal with it inside the church as Christians. So it's a really impactful book. Also, he's done a lot of talks. You may recognize the name. He's been on many prominent Christian podcasts and done many debates and talks on this topic. His clarity in this conversation never ceases to amaze me, the way he wraps his head around this issue. And so I'm really excited to share this with you. We talk about the social binary, we talk about intersectionality, we talk about a lot of these trigger words that you hear in culture, and really unpack what they all mean, what this ideology is, or what this secular religion really is, and then how we should deal with it as a church. Can we interact with this ideology, or should we outright reject this ideology? So hopefully you enjoy this conversation. I know I really did, and hopefully this informs and inspires. With no further ado, here's Neil. Dr. Neil Shenvi, thank you for joining me. Appreciate you coming on Real Talk, and it's good to have you.
My pleasure.
If maybe you can just introduce yourself a little bit, how you got into this world of critical theory and even these social issues.
Good question. So I became a Christian in graduate school in 2001, right before the 9/11 attacks, and got involved in the church in a small group, began listening to Tim Keller sermons, reading Reason for God, things like that. So it's really beneficial to me. But I was mainly interested in apologetics, that is, trying to share the gospel with my atheist friends and colleagues in graduate school. I later went and did a postdoc at Yale, where same thing, I was trying to share the gospel with very intellectual people. And so I wrote my first book. I finished the draft in 2016, and it's called Why Believe. And it really is a basic introduction to Christian apologetics, written to a very elite intellectual audience. I wouldn't say elite. It's written to everybody, but my target audience were my colleagues, people that wanted a really meaty book that didn't treat things superficially. So I'd finished that around 2016, and I was looking around for another project to tackle. And that's around the time when Black Lives Matter was becoming very popular in society and in the church. And I began to see some things creeping into the church that I didn't quite recognize. Something was wrong with couldn't quite put my finger on what. And around that time, I met my co-author and collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who was getting a PhD in what I now know is critical pedagogy, so in the critical tradition. And we began talking, and when he described his thesis work to me, I thought, oh, this sounds very familiar. So I began pressing him on these topics, and he began helping me, guiding my reading. And that's when I began to put the pieces together, that what we were seeing was not just a few scattered political issues, but the emergence of an entirely different worldview that was competing with the Christian worldview. So that culminated in us writing the book Critical Dilemma, which came out last year, which is a very thorough, hopefully accessible, but thorough treatment of critical social theories.
Yeah, I would highly recommend people pick that up. It is a thick book. I think it's pushing 500 or over 500 pages. It's almost 20 hours on Audible. So if you're looking for a project to go through, but yeah, I appreciate your treatment in that book, and also in many of the talks you've done, and the writings you've done on your website also. So maybe just like, I don't want to dive too far into the history, but maybe can you give us a brief synopsis of where did critical theory come from? We don't necessarily need to go all the way back to Karl Marx in depth, but just how did this kind of arise?
So you can't avoid Karl Marx entirely because he's viewed as the fountainhead of critical theory. Uh, People often will just say it's just Marxism applied to race or Marxism applied to gender. That's not actually quite correct, though. So it's not that simple. But he is the first theorist who's recognized as the first quote unquote true critical theorist, because he wanted to do several things. He was trying to understand how power operates within society to create winners and losers, the oppressed and the oppressors. And he was trying to understand how ideas were shaped by material conditions. So how power circulated within society to justify the status quo. And then finally, he wanted social change. He was emphatically not just a theorist. He wanted to apply his theories. That was crucial, obviously, to Marxism. He wanted to see revolution in his day. So, and then I guess the final thing was that he had a whole theory of what's called false consciousness. So he believed that people didn't realize they were oppressed. They had to be shown they were oppressed, because otherwise they would just continue on thinking that everything's fine. So he was the first true critical theorist, but the term critical theory was coined in 1937 by a neo-Marxist named Max Horkheimer. And he and other members of the Frankfurt School took Marx's ideas, but they applied them more broadly than just to class. They wanted to apply them to things like mass media and what they called the culture industry. So they really took Marx's ideas and not just applied them, but critiqued them. So one big question for the neo-Marxists was, why do we not see any huge communist revolutions happening? So Marx is predicting that it's inevitable. The proletariat are going to overthrow the bourgeoisie. We're going to have a communist revolution in all these countries. And, 70 years later, nothing's happened. Right. Maybe in Russia, you get one revolution, but they're kind of at a loss. And so they begin to ask questions like, well, why is that not working? So what the Frankfurt School and Antonio Gramsci do, he's a neo-Marxist in Italy, they begin to say the real obstacle to communist revolution is not just who controls the factories, but who controls the culture. They're the first people to say, actually, the ideas that are circulating within culture are holding back the revolution. So if we want to promote communism, we have to start by dismantling the ideologies that undergird capitalism. So ideologies like the nuclear family, like hierarchy, like capitalism, the private property, the idea that private property is a natural right, that idea is holding back people from realizing there could be another way of living. So the neo-Marxists begin to develop those ideas along those lines. And then since that was in the 20s and 30s, so since then, critical theory has spawned entire disciplines. So today you have things like critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, post-colonial theory, and all of these critical social theories would be under this broad umbrella category of critical theory. So that's right. A short overview. And when people say it's just Marxism, to a zeroth order approximation, I'm like, sort of. But it's sort of like, I try to compare it in our book. I compared this to like someone, an atheist says, what's Christianity? It's like all these Abrahamic religions, like it's like Islam or Judaism or even Hinduism. They all believe in God. And you're like,
Not quite.
not, yeah, exactly. It's exactly right. I mean, that might fly with an atheist, but if you talk to a Christian and you say things like, the first real Christian theologian was Martin Luther, you're like, I'm sorry, no.
Yeah.
You might be Lutheran, but he's not the first theologian.
Yeah, right.
So you got to be very careful to say things like that because it'll discredit you if someone actually knows what they're talking about. I'm not to scare you. I'm just saying it's in the same way that we wouldn't want an atheist talking about Christian theology without studying it. A real critical theorist would not want you talking about critical theory based on what you heard on, Fox News.
Right. Right. That makes sense. So maybe can you walk us through so we hear a lot of these things like critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, like these terms all, like you said, stem out of critical theory kind of proper, back from the Frankfurt School and these ideas that stem from there. Can you walk us through like what are the core tenets of critical theory itself? Yeah, but let's start there and then we'll work on how that kind of displays itself in culture.
That's right. And so how to think about it is Pat and I, in our book, we identify something called contemporary critical theory, which just means the stuff we see today all over culture. Yep. And what are the 4 basic tenets of contemporary critical theory? And so let me list them really fast. So the first one, which is very recognizable, is what we call the social binary. The idea that society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, religion, colonial status, age, physical ability, and a host of other identity markers. So that's the way that contemporary critical theory views the world. And you can find diagrams and tables and figures illustrating these ideas. It's not like I'm making it up. It's like you can reprint these pictures from textbooks showing that straight white men are oppressors and that disabled Black lesbians are oppressed, and there's this social binary. That's number one. The second idea is called hegemonic power. Hegemonic power refers to the idea that certain groups, the ruling classes, control the ideas of society. So whites have hegemonic power, and that means they impose their white values, their white norms, their white rules on culture in a way that appears to us natural. So we don't even recognize that we're living in a society that's dominated by white supremacy. In the same way, men impose their masculine values via the patriarchy. So when we take it for granted, we think that what we see is natural, neutral, objective, rational, but actually we're imbibing the norms and values of the patriarchy. And Christians impose their values on culture, and heterosexuals impose the gender binary on culture. So all these hidden, subtle narratives, they all are there to substantiate and to justify the power and the dominance of the ruling class, whether it's whites or men or heterosexuals. That's the second idea. The third idea is lived experience. So the question, if you accept those first 2 ideas that we're all brainwashed into these hegemonic narratives, well, how do you escape that? And the answer is through your lived experience. So the idea is that oppressed people, whether they're people of color or women or LGBTQ people or the disabled, that oppressed groups have a special access to reality through their experience of injustice. And whereas the rest of us, if we're part of privileged groups, are blinded by our privilege. So for us, we should defer to the authority and the wisdom and the guidance of oppressed groups because they've woken up colloquially. Well, they've achieved in the literature what's called a critical or a liberatory consciousness, but colloquially, they've gotten woke. So then the rest of us should defer to them. And then the fourth idea is social justice. So the end goal, the telos of contemporary critical theory is achieving the promised land of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The idea is to tear down all of these oppressive narratives, these systems and structures that justify the dominance of the ruling class, and then to achieve equity, a state in which all groups are essentially equal. We all have equal access to resources, and there is no one dominant hegemonic narrative that excludes or others certain groups. That's the end goal. So the four ideas: social binary, hegemonic power, lived experience, and social justice. And as you can tell, if you're listening to this, you're like, whoa, that explains so much of what I'm seeing. And in the book, we're very careful. We document these ideas. We're not just making them up. We have 770 plus footnotes, hundreds of primary sources, block quotes, thousands of words, block quotes. We're not just spinning these statements. We're saying, no, they really believe this stuff.
And so these are tenets that the writers or thinkers about critical theory have actually documented through their
I mean, there's not like a list of like the 10 commandments of critical theory.
Right.
This is a very diverse discipline. But if you look at these books, you'll say, oh, yeah, right. I mean, one of the best books to read as a primary source is D'Angelo and Sensuo's book, Is Everyone Really Equal? This is Robin DiAngelo, the famous author of White Fragility, but she wrote a textbook used in college classes that Pat's taught, actually. And it's called Is Everyone Really Equal? And you can, if you read that book, you'll be like, everything Neil says is exactly right. There's a whole box call out on hegemonic power and what it is. There, the social binary is a table. I think it's table 5.1 that shows different oppressor and oppressed groups, and it lists all of them, the various oppressions. And it talks about lived experience and social, and it contrasts critical social justice, by which she means critical theory's version of social justice, with traditional versions of justice. And one of the things she says is that traditionally we understand justice in terms of procedures, like you have just laws that treat everyone fairly. And she says that's not the way to think about critical social justice, which is really about seeing these hidden systems of power and then overturning them. So they won't have bullet points like 1, 2, 3, 4, but these ideas will absolutely be expounded in their texts.
Wow. So if we walk through these 4, could you give us, if we can do that together, then can you explain, like, where do we see these? I think you've already touched on some of them, like intersectionality and things like that. Like, where do we see these tenets kind of coming out in culture in a more common place? Like, the academic side is one thing, but what do we see on the ground, kind of a thing? So if we talk about the social binary, probably a main one that our listeners will have heard is intersectionality, that everyone is oppressed or an oppressor. And you alluded to the different groups that people can fall into, but can you expand on that? How do we see that? How do people take that to another kind of level?
Sure. And so intersectionality is a great concept that ties these all together. So we talked about how critical theory spawned different disciplines: critical race theory, critical pedagogy, queer theory, post-colonial theory. But the concept of intersectionality, which was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 and 1991. So she's a famous critical race theorist. But that concept really tied all of these disciplines together inextricably. So today, after the intersectional revolution in the late 80s, today you cannot find a book on critical race theory that will not include entire sections on gender or entire sections on sexuality. You cannot find a book on disability theory that does not mention race, because let me explain why. So in her original paper, she coined the term. She's so very prominent. Actually, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality. She also coined the term critical race theory. So she's extremely important, right? There's a video of her actually talking about that at a 2019 American Sociological Association conference. People will say, that's not true. I'm like, well, she says it right here. Anyway, so her papers, she's explained in her papers that the problem with anti-racism in her day and with feminism in her day was that they either focused solely on race or solely on gender. But she argued that the experience of Black women, say, cannot be reduced to the experience of a Black person plus the experience of a woman. And you sort of put them together and you get a Black woman. She's like, no, Black women experience unique forms of discrimination and unique stereotypes, unique challenges. And that observation by itself is just true, right? I mean, and so she actually showed examples of this. She said, is a case of anti-discrimination, a lawsuit against, I think it was GM, General Motors. And General Motors she said they could defend themselves by saying, hey, we don't discriminate against Black people. There are plenty of Black people here. And we discriminate against women either because there are plenty of women here. But she pointed out that if you make that claim, you could have 0 Black women. You have plenty of Black men and plenty of white women, but you, for whatever reason, you discriminate against Black women only. And that is invisible to this if you're only looking at people separately. You're either Black or you're. And so that's a fair point. They're actually in other fields like sociology, there's something, it's called an interaction effect. Like these two categories interact. So this is not, it's like a mathematical concept. It's not very complicated. However, she does not merely mean that. So when she introduces this common sense idea, like you hear that, you're like, well, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, for example, the phrase straight white male, that's uniquely a bad category today, right? You're saying it's not a straight Black woman is, oh, well, that's, or a gay, white. So that, obviously there's especially a bad category today if you're, in the progressive space of straight white male. It's not just, you're just happen to be straight and happy. These categories combine to make you uniquely bad. Well, that's intersectionality only flipped. But my point is this. She means much more than that. What she's arguing in her paper is that actually that she assumes the social binary. She assumes that whites are on top of Blacks, men are on top of women, straight people are on top of gay people, and that she, in her own words, it's like a ladder. And people at the very top of the ladder are, say, straight white males, and the bottom of the ladder you have people oppressed by numerous categories. So this is where you get the idea of adding up your intersectionality points. The more oppressed categories you fall into, the worse your oppression. Then that's one thing that she's mentioning. She says she assumes the social binary. The other thing that she assumes is that these categories are inextricable. So you cannot just talk about race. If you talk about race, you must talk about gender, class, and sexuality. So she literally, you cannot just be anti-racist. This idea would be repeated by Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the final thing that she says in her papers is that to understand the experiences of a Black woman, you cannot simply ask a Black man and a white woman. You have to, in her words, look to the margin. You have to go to those groups, and they have unique insight into their own lives. So those three things, what do you see? You see the social binary, you see the hegemonic power of straight white males over everybody else, and you see the importance of lived experience. And I think for Christians, what's crucial is this: intersectionality from the very beginning has been a quote unquote defining element of critical race theory. So Christians, a lot of them say, well, we can use CRT as just a tool to understand race by itself, not invoking sexuality, because obviously they understand sexuality very differently than the Bible does, but we can separate that out. And what Crenshaw will tell you, and what the core defining elements of CRT will tell you, is you can't do that. Intersectionality is fundamentally part of CRT, and it has been from the very beginning. So they will slap your hand if you try to say, well, we don't want to talk about sexuality. She'll say, no, you can't not talk about sexuality.
Right.
And I can give you lots of references. Yeah, very important.
Yeah. So that touches on the first three kind of tenets. When we get to social justice, I think we see people applying this, like in the BLM riots and stuff like that. You hear a lot of these terms being used from the media. What is the goal of the social justice liberation kind of that this ideology is aimed at?
See, it's aimed at dismantling the systems and structures that perpetuate the social binary. And when we talk about systems and structures, they don't just mean economic stuff. Like, they're not just saying, take away the factories from the bourgeois. That's what Marx would say. But remember, critical social theorists today are more about ideas. So they want to dismantle the ideas that they view as at the real heart of oppression. So, for example, this is why Black Lives Matter, the official website organization, one of their stated goals was decentering the nuclear family. They view that as a sort of cis heteropatriarchal construct that is marginalizing certain family structures. So to truly achieve equity, you have to get rid of the idea that there's one right way of expressing your sexuality, there's one normal way of having a family, that is oppressive. And or another idea that you hear a lot is equity. Now, got to be careful because some people will claim it just means equality of opportunity. That's not true. There's, and you have to be careful because they can be pretty slippery with this. They might say something like, by equity, we just mean equality of opportunity. We want every group to have equal access to resources. Say, well, that actually sounds kind of reasonable. I also want people to have equal access to resources. But here's the problem. If you ask them, well, how do you know whether or not people have equal access to resources? They will say, look at the outcomes. So Kamala Harris, when she was running for vice president, she had a video where she explained equity. And one of the lines in the video is, if we all have equal opportunity, then we will all end up in the same place.
Right.
That's so. In other words, so, and if we don't end up in the same place, then there must not have been equality opportunity. But that's not true. People will use their opportunities differently, and it doesn't have to be bad. Like I might choose to use my opportunities to become an athlete or a singer or a doctor or a lawyer. I have all the opportunities as everyone else, but I just chose. I prefer doing this low-paying work or high-paying work for whatever, or creative work. You cannot just assume that if you give people equal opportunities, then every group will end up in the same place. That's not true. And again, there's tons of books and articles and research on this topic. One very common classic book, not classic, but it's recent, but it's a good book, is Thomas Sowell is a Black economist. He wrote a book called Discrimination and Disparities. And he just showed that even within a single family, the firstborn child often is much more successful than later born children within the same family. So,
interesting.
Yeah, and it's a very common finding. Now, would you argue that shows there was a sort of unfair treatment that we have to destroy through governmental intervention? Well, no, that's crazy. You just can't do that. And even more than that, even if you wanted to provide equal opportunity, truly equal opportunity, you just can't while respecting people's, I don't know how to put it, without being communists. So, so the North Carolina passed a resolution a couple of years ago, which I spoke out against, but they wanted to reorient their educational framework, K through 12 framework, around the central feature of equity, which they defined as equal opportunity. But then they said, and some of the things that are keeping people from equal opportunity are things like poverty, health disparities. I don't remember what else, like family structure, single moms. And then they said in one sentence, they're like, and we're going to achieve equity of outcome. And it was almost like a little slip out, a little Freudian slip there, but they said equity of outcome. And I'm thinking, let's just say you wanted to. I want to make sure everybody has equal opportunity. How can you ensure that a kid living in a single parent home in poverty has the same opportunities as a rich kid in a two-parent home, as a public school? I'm not even saying it's a bad thing, but how could you do that? Are you going to take them out of their home and put them into a group home and put everybody in as one headmaster and you don't see your parents ever? And there's no way to do that in real life. And if you start this utopian idea that we can somehow re-engineer society to erase the effects of poverty, to erase the effects of having a single parent run, you can't do that as much as we might want to. So, and that's where you get into really invasive and I would say dangerous social engineering to try to fix problems that you just can't fix as a school. Now, as an individual, I might want to go and work with a single mom, help her out for extra assistance, but to have the entire public school system try to fix all society's problems, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So if you take critical theory at its face, like, that's the goal, is to have this equity. Do they care whether or not it's, a possible, be like reasonable to even do it, or C, would hurt people? Like, do they?
Yeah, no. So one of the earliest critiques of critical race theory from liberals, not from conservatives, liberals critique critical race theory, which at the time was largely a legal theory. because they were saying it's purely destructive. You're out here talking about all these laws are inequitable. They all produce unjust outcomes because they incarcerate people of color at higher rates than whites, and the rule of law itself is Eurocentric. There's a paper on that by Tommy Curry. The law itself, legal reasoning is Eurocentric, and they say all this stuff, and that these liberal law professors were saying, you want to tear our legal system to the ground and replace it with what exactly? You've given us no guidance at all about what utopian vision you have that's going to achieve true equity. And that's the hard part. Breaking stuff is easy and building stuff is hard. And all critical social theories really do is they break stuff. They critique, they're critical theories. They critique stuff. They don't offer replacements. There's a funny joke that Thomas Sowell tells, actually. I saw it on like some interview he did. And he talked about economists are always dealing with trade-offs. There's always trade-offs. There's like every good has a bad side, every downside is upside. So he said an economist ran into an old colleague, and the colleague asked him, hey, I haven't seen you for a long time. How's your marriage going? And the economist says, compared to what? And his point was, you have to have a comparison. You might say our system is terrible. Well, compared to what? What do you propose as an alternative? That's a very valid point. So what I'm saying, something similar, is that when you say our current educational system lets kids fall through the cracks, poor kids have it really tough. They can't work as well as rich kids. I say, hey, that's exactly right. I agree, actually. If you tell me that, I'm like, I agree with you. But then what's your proposed alternative? Breaking it.
Right. And they don't have,
I'm sorry.
They don't have anything?
Give me something more than that, because and frankly, if you look at the outcomes, I'm not an education scholar, but there have been plenty of scholars who've looked at the outcomes of these programs and said they're disastrous. I mean, some of the more obvious ones is they're like, we need to get rid of racial disparity in educational outcomes or scores. The big racial gap in test scores in the US, which is true. But some of the solutions, unfortunately, are get rid of the tests. You get rid of the test gap disappears because there are no more tests. That's not a solution. That's worse than a Band-Aid. And this actually happened with the Supreme Court in the US, found that schools like Harvard were discriminating against Asians in admissions. And it was, I won't go into the details if you haven't followed US Supreme Court decisions, but the bottom line is a lot of schools are seeing that Blacks and Hispanics score lower on average, of course, on average, than whites and especially Asians on tests like the SAT, the ACT. Their solution, though, is to get rid of standardized testing on admissions. Like they don't allow you to submit your standardized tests. But a lot of people have pointed out, who does that? It looks good on paper. You're like, see, no more gaps in like the admissions criteria. But they're like, who does that actually benefit? Well, who's going to benefit most from having no objective measure of their performance, right? And the answer is rich kids who can get mommy and daddy to hire an editor to write their college admissions essay, who can pull a few strings, who can say, I was on the yacht club. They don't have any test scores to show that they're not qualified to go to Harvard.
Right.
But again, the critical theorists don't really think that far ahead. They're like, this system is broken because of the outcomes, so get rid of it, without saying, well, what's the alternative?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even guys like Jordan Peterson have pointed out, like, we can't, as Christians, or I mean, he would point out just as conservatives, you can't assume that when somebody's breaking something in society, they're breaking it because they have an alternative, or they're even aiming up in any real sense. Like they could just be aiming down. And
they're just angry.
He says that quite a bit.
Yeah.
Which, this got me thinking about that, like social justice. Like we've seen it in Canada too, them tearing statues down and and just burning society. They just don't want to remember, or don't even I know you've chatted about this before, like just tearing down history, and it's basically saying there were no good men back in the day. So basically our society is built on nothing. So yeah, I think that's a really it's a really important point just to know as Christians that there really is no alternative. But what are some of the positives, I guess? Because I mean, a lot of your work has stemmed around how Christians are getting roped in by um, this ideology. So
Mhm.
what are some of like the positives that we see in critical theory um, that are good to consider?
Yeah, we have a whole chapter in our book on the positives of critical social theory. So there's some general ones, there's some specific ones. One obvious one is that critical theory makes us think about how power works, and it can be subtle. That's true, right? That it's true that we often don't realize the kind of power we wield, and power is not always overt. Like, oh, you're powerful because you have a bunch of money, or you're in a
Mm,
government office. Social power is real. Unspoken norms are real, right? Think about how you'd feel if you walked around the store in a bathrobe. You're like, oh, I'd be embarrassed. Yeah, but why? Because there's certain standards of how you dress that we don't just take for granted. Now, by the way,
mm,
does that mean that you should walk around in the store in your bathrobe? No, I'm just saying sometimes those standards are neutral. They're just
mm,
there. We can't. There are always going to be some standards. Sometimes they're good, like the gender binary is a good God ordained standard. It's just reality. God created male and female. But other social norms are actually bad. Look at Jim Crow. Like the social norms under Jim Crow in the States where the blacks and whites were segregated. But if you're black, you weren't supposed to look a white man in the eye. Or, if you walked on the same street, you should get off the street, let the white person pass first, go to the back of the bus. These were social norms, but they were wrong. And Christians
mm,
should have said, no, that's not a proper way to think about humanity. So critical theory asks us to reflect on what norms are there that we don't notice. The difference is, of course, they think all norms in some ways are oppressive, whereas we would say, no, some norms are God ordained, some norms are neutral, and only some norms are bad because the Bible would critique them. The Bible is
mm,
our standard, so objective standard for judging norms. Another example, this is an obvious one, but it's true, that race is a social construct. That's a core tenet of critical race theory, and it's true. The modern understanding of race that we can divide society or divide humanity into these buckets: white, black, Asian, Hispanic. It's not true. I mean, the most obvious way to see that is to ask yourself, what does the Asian bucket mean? I mean, Asia, if you've been there, 4 billion people, I don't know
mm,
how many dozens of countries, thousands of languages, different religions, people at war with each other. When I call someone Asian, what on earth? That bucket is a completely man-made thing. And what's worse is that the modern category of race was not an innocent thing. It was created in order to justify African slavery. So critical race theorists are right about that. Now, so for Christians, that's good to realize, oh yeah, race is something that we invented around the 1700s. Now, the category in the Bible that's biblical category is ethnicity, the
mm,
ethnos or ethnoi, the idea of nations or people groups. Those are other synonyms. There are groups of people, they have a unique culture, language, history. In biology, there are population groups. I mean, obviously, some people have dark skin and curly hair, and other people have pale skin. Sure. I mean, those are real categories. But I'm just saying the buckets of race. Like, look at a person. This is a good example. You look at a person really far away. You're like, oh yeah, they're black. But what is that telling you? They could be literally from Africa, speaking another language. They could be your extra neighbor. They could be from the Caribbean. They could be from Italy. They could have come from Italy. They've been there for centuries because they came from the Moors. So the point is
mm,
just that category. Oh, a white guy. He could speak different languages. He could be a Turkish peasant. He could be a Russian czar. Those categories are things we've invented. They tell
right.
us very, very little about anything about the person,
Mm,
but they have social meaning. Obviously, in the States, to say that you're black or white in the States, there are stereotypes, there are expectations about you that are just there, and they're not always positive. So we can be mindful of that. Again, critical race theory is right to point that out. And then even a last thing with queer theory is awful. It is poison, but even it has some true ideas. For example, it will highlight in a very pernicious way, but it will highlight things like there are intersex individuals. So intersex is a very small category. Some people are born with biology that is indeterminate. It's hard to look at their biology and say whether they're male or female. There's a case actually in the Olympics recently with two boxers. It seems like both were intersex. And in their cases, it seems pretty clear that they are both male biologically, but they have a very rare condition where they are resistant to male hormones that they produce. And so they developed as biological females, like sort of externally. That is very rare. Less than 1 in 2,000 babies. It's hard to define it, but there are many conditions that would fall under intersex umbrella. It's roughly 1 in 2,000 or fewer that have these conditions, but they're real people, and they have, it's very hard to know. Well, yeah, ethically, what do you do if you're intersex? How do we treat people like that? We love them, we care for them, but it's hard. It's like any other. I would view it as a medical disability, right? It's not, something's gone wrong in their development. They're not less human. They're like someone who's disabled. But my point is, queer theory will highlight people like that, say they exist. And I'm like, yeah, Christians should have realized that and should not be just shocked. I mean, I saw some Christians with the Olympics that were being very cruel to this boxer who it seems like the boxer is Khalif Imani. I think it is a he because Imani has XY chromosomes, but the Christians were confusing intersex with trans. Like this person was just pretending to be a woman out of some perverse pleasure in beating women up. And I'm like, no.
Right, yeah.
They were raised as a girl in Algeria, where trans is completely verboten and haram. And no, so this is not the case of someone just pretending to be a woman to beat up women and win gold medals. Right. So Christians should be aware of that. And the difference, that's an important distinction, though. What queer theorists do is they say because intersex exists as a category biologically, therefore gender is totally fluid and malleable. And I can declare myself to be anything I want. And Christians, the right response is no. Right. Intersex is a biological condition, not an ideology. And the Christian position, queer theory helps us articulate the proper Christian position, which is this. There's biological sex, male and female, and the social category of gender is grounded in our biological sex. So whether we get categorized in society as masculine or feminine, those categories are rooted in our biology. Now, intersex is a case where biology is actually indeterminate. It's hard to tell, right? So of course, then we struggle to figure out, well, what category should this person be in because their biology is legitimately unclear. But that does not call into question the idea that biology is the basis for social categories. Right. Again, but what I'm saying is that by thinking about critical theory, that will help us understand and articulate a uniquely Christian ideas about race, gender, etc.
Yeah, that helps a lot. So we've used the word ideology a few times. And like you alluded to in this example, once you have an instance of like something like intersex people, critical theory takes that to be, well, then there must be categories, there must be oppression. We don't have to stick with the binary that exists in culture or in Christianity. As Christians, though, I think one of the main points that you make is that we have to view critical theory as a religion or as a worldview that basically takes over your view of Christianity. If you were to accept everything, at the very least, and then we can get into whether or not you can or cannot, take critical theory for what it's worth and, discard parts of it or say you're aligned with it. But you described in one of your talks that I watched, I thought it was really, really well done. You described the arc of Christianity being creation, the fall, redemption, and then restoration to God. And you describe it, the arc of critical theory being basically at odds with the way the arc of Christianity is explained and how we understand it, what we believe. Could you explain that and explain why, like, we only really have as Christians an option to view critical theory as another worldview or like an opposing counter-Christian religion?
Yeah, and that's a common way to view it. So you look at Carl Trueman's book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's an evangelical scholar in the U.S. And James Lindsay and Helen Pluckers are atheists, and all of them and other people too will say this is a religion. It's not like it's not I'm the only one saying that. Lots of people are saying wokeness is a religion. And talked about the trajectory, the meta narrative of Christianity is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. The meta narrative, the overarching story of critical theory is there's no creation element. We're not made in God's image. We're not individuals who relate first to God and then other people. Actually, if we are in any sense created, we're created by these narratives. We were raised as black or white. We were gendered as male or female. We were put into these categories by society, and we're not created by God as individuals. And then the problem is not fall and sin. The problem is oppression. Some of these groups have seized power and are imposing their values on the rest of us. The solution is not redemption through Jesus. The solution is activism. We have to divest ourselves of privilege and work to overturn these power structures. And the end goal is not restoration, that we glorified body and new heavens and new earth. The end goal is earthly utopia, that we're going to achieve a state in which there's no more oppression. We're going to dismantle all these hegemonic narratives. So that's one way to think about these two competing stories. Another, in terms of worldview, looks at the big questions that we have in life. Every person answers the big questions like, who am I? What is my purpose in life? Well, what is good? What is evil? Do these exist? What is, what should I do? Where's meaning found? Well, Christianity answers the big questions. Obviously, go to the Westminster Catechism. Why do you exist? What's your purpose? What is your identity? Christianity says you're made in God's image, and your purpose is to enjoy God and glorify Him forever. What's good and evil? Well, God tells us what good and evil is. He is the source of all good. Where do I find meaning in life? I find meaning in life through the stories God is telling. God's telling me the story of redemption. Things are meaningful because God values them. Well, critical theory offers very different answers. Like, who am I? You're the member of one of these various oppressor groups. What's good and evil? Well, the only real good is liberation. The only real evil is oppression. Anything that stands in the way of liberation is evil, it's oppression. What is my source of meaning? I find meaning in activism. I find meaning and purpose in standing up against the oppressors and working for liberation. So in all these various ways, we just see these completely different answers that are given by Christianity versus critical theory, and you really can't combine them. And an obvious example that we're seeing more and more is sexuality. Either you believe that sexuality is God ordained, or gender even, God ordained categories. You have male and female that are united in marriage to produce children, or it's totally that very norm, heterosexism, is a kind of oppression. The gender binary is oppressive. There's no middle ground. Either the gender binary is ordained by God and therefore good, or it is an oppressive thing built by man to oppress you. There's no third way. So
Right.
in all of these areas, you're going to find yourself being torn between Christianity's answers and critical theory's answers.
Yeah, well, that's the one thing that really surprised me there, or that kind of opened my eyes, was that they derive meaning from activism. And you see that, like, there's a lot of, I mean, as Christians, we think they're like just appalling displays. But if you view it through the lens, some of these social movements through the lens of a critical theorist, it's their way to redeem themselves, work out their own liberation, their own salvation in their worldview. And so it struck me that it's hard to even blame them for, I mean, obviously you can blame them for adopting the ideology, but when you adopt the ideology, like, it just leads you to these very radical displays of activism.
It's coherent. It's not random. Yeah. People keep thinking, oh, this is just weird progressive stuff. I'm like, it's not weird and eclectic. It's very consistent. Yeah. Like, I can tell you exactly where everyone will land on any position based on their belief in critical theory. Like, another example is Queers for Palestine, all the Hamas Israel stuff. Like, you see these signs that, Queers for Palestine, I saw infographics like Palestinian justice is climate justice, is reproductive justice, is feminist issues. Like they're all the same to them.
Yeah.
And you're like, why is that intersectionality? They're all oppressed groups working for liberation, and therefore you can't separate out climate activism from feminism, from transgender activism, from all of its. It's not just related; it's inseparable. They're
Yeah.
following right from Crenshaw's playbook.
Do we ever see them butt heads? Because
Yes.
even the LGBTQ whatever group, like, I mean, there's lots of people who speak about this. Like, it's you can't even really view that as a group. It doesn't make sense. Like,
Right.
um, but then yeah, Queers for Palestine might be a really good example actually to use. But like, where do these people like? Do they ever butt heads in society where they're like where we see this kind of ideology crumbling, where they can't all align?
So you'd think, but remember the goal is always liberation. And so also remember they don't really care much about consistency. And when we're talked about like, well, what if these destroying the education system actually makes things worse? They don't really think about that. Their goal is
Right.
just destruction. So, but one of the areas where it showed up first actually is the animosity between radical feminists and trans activists. So today, and you saw this with J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, that she came out years ago opposing transgender ideology. She wrote a very progressive letter about how she is not opposed to same-sex marriage, live however you want, love whoever you want, be whatever gender you want. All of that's fine for her. But she draws the line at, say, letting male sex offenders room in women's prisons because they identify as women. She's like, you can't do that. Sex-based rights are important. As a sex abuse survivor, I do not want men coming into women's prisons. And because of that, for the last 5 or 6 years, she has been blasted on social media as a transphobe, a bigot. People want to burn her books. And the term that's being used for people like her is a TERF, TERF,
Mm.
trans exclusionary radical feminists. And basically, these are just old school feminists who think that sex, biological sex, is an important category that we can't deconstruct. And
Right.
there is tremendous tension, but there's tension there between the trans activists and the quote unquote TERFs. But the trans activists have basically won. Like every department of, I'm told by academicians that if you go to like a gender studies department, it will be purely trans queer theory stuff.
Right.
That old school radical feminism has been marginalized. And so there's a saying, right, that revolution devours its own, that
Mm.
eventually you were on the cutting edge 10 years ago, and now you are the enemy because you are
Well,
not
yeah.
on the, you're not on the most cutting edge today. So
Mm.
that does actually, man, I'm writing another book with Pat, a sequel, and we highlight how there are actual articles talking about how lesbians are getting really troubled because they're being pressured. This is really gross and weird, but I'll put it mildly. Lesbians are being pressured to date trans women, meaning to date men who identify as women. And lesbians are like, I'm a lesbian. I do not want to date a biological man who thinks he's a woman because I'm a lesbian.
Mm.
And they're being told they're transphobic and pressured to, and they're lesbian dating sites, they're lesbian bars. They're being, they would say, infiltrated by trans women, men who identify as women. And there's a real tension there, like you said, because lesbians are not frightened, but they do feel the pressure to not make waves because these are their supposed allies.
Mm-hmm.
But they're like, but you're just literally coming into my one space that I can be myself and taking it away.
Is
Anyway,
that yeah?
yeah,
Is that because like they yeah, like I thought the same thing when you were talking. Like it was like being gay was like the thing that people were pushing for, whatever, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And now is it because that like that group has decided maybe like this is the torch carrying marginalized group that can help like push our cause even further? Like, 'cause you almost get a feeling like there's not really interest from these groups from, like just a gay couple who, now is allowed to be married by law.
yeah.
So I feel like there's not a lot of pressure or a lot of desire for them to like want to push where this is the norm. They're not, a lot of them aren't not looking for like, they're not looking to make other people gay. So
Right. So
does it really
there is,
align with
yeah,
like,
there is like on Twitter, for example, there are various like LGB without the T movements. There are
mm,
groups that are pushing back against the queer theory. But I think I would actually agree with people that are Christians who have said basically, you've made your bed, now you've got to lie in it. Like the same arguments you were making against the Christian position are now being made against your position, and you don't like it.
mm-hmm,
Well, sorry, like you can't just, it's called the taxi cab fallacy. You can't order the taxi cab, have it take you to a destination, then say, I didn't want to be here, I want to get out. Like, well, this is what you wanted. When
yeah,
you push for the deconstruction of, and a good example would be how the Supreme Court in the U.S., the Obergefell decision, when they legalized same-sex marriage, the decision, I don't know if it actually explicitly addressed or not, but basically I think it did, where it talked about, well, why only two? Like if we're going to appeal to tradition and to natural law for why marriage is between a man and a woman, and you're saying no, 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 it's all about personal freedom and autonomy and love, defining love for yourself and value. Well, that's all that is required for marriage definitionally. Why can't it be a throuple or a polycule? And why can't it be 8 people all married? And again, I don't know if the Supreme Court answered it directly. I thought they did though. And they said something like, "Well, that's just no one thinks that," or it goes against tradition. Like,
that's
well, wait a
basically
minute.
although they're on the argument. Yeah.
It's basically just a matter of like 30 years
The
until someone
answer is
says,
because
yeah,
that's still weird.
because that's still weird. And it's getting less weird. For example, I think the New Yorker ran a cover article a few months ago on polyamory, which is the new hot thing. And you don't
Yep.
have couples anymore. You just have these huge polyamorous groups, and it's degenerate. I'm sorry, it's really evil and bad. Um,
Mhm.
but it's the logical outcome of these premises, and they're just taking a little while to work out. These ideas, they were incubated in the ivory tower in the 70s and 60s. They took 30 years to mature and germinate in the popular culture. It'll take 30 more years maybe to get into the courts, but they're going to get there eventually.
Mm,
And the other thing too, that as Christians, we have to remember that one, we shouldn't and fearlessly appeal to the Bible and to reality, to natural law, the way God intended things. Um, but also, it helps understand why these ideas are attractive to people, because they play on our desire to help the vulnerable, to comfort the hurting. But that means that if anyone can position themselves as a victim or as vulnerable, then we start immediately knee-jerk reacting and saying, I want to help them. But that's not a bad impulse, frankly. It's not bad to want to help people that are hurting and be compassionate. But that compassion has to be tethered to reality. And reality is God's reality, which means that whenever you disobey him, whenever you sin, you are actually working against your own good, whether you know it or not. You might really, my 5-year-old, right, my 9-year-old really thinks that if I would just let him eat a pound of chocolate, he'd be great. He'd be doing fine. And I have to say to him, no. And he says, how, you're so heartless. How could you not give me a pound of chocolate? I'm saying, because I know better than you do what's good for you.
mm.
And I have to tether my compassion to reality. So that's what we need to do as Christians when it comes to people that really say, this is how I was born. I know it's right for me. We say, no, it's because of what God has revealed to us. We know it's not right for you.
Yeah. And that's something, do you find that like I want to get into how we as Christians address these things and to what extent can we interact with this theory or these people, or even these books that are written. But do you find that the issues that kind of plague the church or who are that are entering the church are kind of the ideas that are lagging behind the radical part of these ideologies? So say like transgenderism is very easy for people to say no to, but you've pointed out in some of your work that even queer theory is being questioned in the church, which is something where like that's kind of it's it is one and the same, but it's like it seems to be like we can take a more moderate version and apply it to the church. Similar to like race, like critical race theory is a lot easier to interact with and accept as a Christian than the transgender stuff because we can just flat out say that's wrong. We can pull passages out of the Bible and say, like, look, here it's wrong.
Mhm.
Do you find that it's kind of like the soft side of the the ideology that kind of seeps in? And then do you see that like progressing? Like, are we going to be one day, worried that the church is accepting transgenderism for this, because there's such a more radical version out there?
So I think the good news is that it's almost the reverse happening. Is that the American church? I can't speak of Canada. The American church was really having trouble dealing with CRT because Americans obviously are very ashamed of our racial history, and rightly so. So because of that, and we're kind of looking at critical race theory and saying, well, there are a lot of racial disparities. Racism is real; it still exists. It's a really bad thing. And so maybe I can kind of compromise with critical race theory a little bit. Maybe we can use it as a tool or something, and it's okay. And then so it was really hard then to convince people that no, actually, if you read the primary sources, this is really bad stuff. And that took me years, right? But I think we're finally getting there. But the way we got there primarily was this: when critical race theorists began to openly push for transgender, that's when Christians hit the brakes. They were like, wait a minute. When when people realized that BLM was not just about ending police brutality, which I think everyone's like, yeah, we want to end police brutality and racism. That's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you're like, wait a minute, but then they suddenly tie Black Lives Matter explicitly into destroying heteronormativity and lifting up trans people. That's when that fact that became more and more recognized made evangelical Christians in the US say, let's go back. Something went wrong. What went wrong? And then that's when they realized, oh, it was always bad. So it's almost like they bit off more than they could chew. And so I'm encouraged by that. I think that actually in the last 2 years, evangelicals in the US have gotten much better about critical race theory and realizing that it's bad. But I think it's because of the transgender stuff that's
Right.
what really made people realize that this is more than just opposing racism. So that's the good news. And I think it's obviously true that it's much easier to see why, say, transgender activism is unbiblical than it is to see why anti-racism is unbiblical.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's a lot buried in that word anti-racism. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So when someone says, "Are you anti-racist?" You're like, "Yeah, right. I am, aren't I? Because I think racism is bad, so I must be anti-racist. I'm not pro-racist." But when someone says, "Are you pro-transgender?" You're like, "No."
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So I think that's honestly, I do think that has been it's added clarity to the discussion to see the same people pushing like Kendi outright saying things like you cannot be an anti-racist if you're not also pro LGBTQ and pro transgender.
Right.
Then people and Christians felt comfortable saying, well, I guess I'm not an anti-racist by your definition.
Right.
And I would say, good, you're not. Not by his definition. I am anti-racist by the Bible's definition, but
Right.
not
Yeah.
by yours.
Well, and the real definition of anti and racist.
That's right. Yeah,
Which
exactly.
is
Not your
their
fake
definition.
one.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this kind of gets into where I was hoping that this discussion would go, and hopefully we can like advance this just a little, like the discussion a little bit in the Christian circles. Our audience is a lot of Reformed Christians, and you did a podcast with or kind of a debate style on Sean McDowell's show. I don't honestly, I haven't listened to a ton of what Sean's done, but you were on there with Ed Uzinski, Dr. Ed
Yeah.
Uzinski. So he's taking he's a pastor who's done a lot of work with us. He actually wrote a book which Unraveling, is it Unraveling?
Untangling CRT.
Untangling
Yeah.
CRT. And so he deals with the race side of it a lot more. And obviously that's easier to deal with as a Christian, but he had some points I think like that were probably the most common ways I see critical race theory seeping into our churches. And kind of like sympathizing with CRT, or not being willing to say this is bad point, like, like just let's just get rid of it.
Mhm.
And so I guess for our listeners, like part of your book explains why critical race theory is just bad, but bar none,
Mhm.
this is just a bad ideology. As we talked about, it's just anti-Christian. And then you have a chapter on how to discuss and stuff like that. And Ed came at it a little bit more from like a pastoral perspective where he wanted to understand someone's basically lived experience, which
Right.
is like a kind of trigger word in this whole discussion. Um, can you yeah, maybe just start by like can you reflect on that discussion? It was only from a few months ago. And what did you see from Ed's perspective from the pastoral side? Um, do you sympathize with that perspective at all? Is there a way that we can use critical theory in our discussions, or is it really a lens that we can look through as Christians to
Yeah.
understand things?
Yeah, I would say so. I told him at the end of the debate, I was like, he kept saying, you're looking at this as an apologist. I'm looking at this as a pastor. I want to understand people's stories. You want to understand the ideas. And I said, and my response was like, I'm totally fine with pastorally meeting someone one on one, just talking with them to understand where they're coming from and all that stuff. But at some point, we have to have firm in our own minds that these ideas are false,
Mm,
and we have to communicate to them that their ideas are false. We can take a long time to get there. So first of all, as a pastor, you have to be rock solid on the idea, say that these ideas are false. How you want to introduce that in the conversation, how you want to take time to listen first, that's in pastoral, that's fine. But I said, but my issue is that right now in the church, we do not agree the ideas are false, right? And so I want clarity on that first. Once we're
mm,
all there, once we're all saying absolutely these ideas are false, then do all the pastoral stuff, all the relational stuff that you want, all the conversational stuff. But because we're not there yet, we have to address it. We can't just spend all of our time, meeting the person and chatting with them. So that was one thing. And then the other that's a big difference. I'm not saying it's wrong to approach this relationally. I'm saying that we have to do that, one, understanding ourselves the ideas are bad, and then two, at some point, making sure that they understand that too and are agreeing with that, rather
mm,
than just doing nothing but relational stuff forever. And then the other thing that difference between us, I think, was that he really believes that you can sort of separate out the wheat from the chaff, the meat from the bones when it comes to CRT. You can take an idea from CRT and use it fruitfully as a Christian. And I kept pointing out that if you look at the actual primary sources, the actual texts emphatically, uniformly say what CRT is and what it definitionally is.
yep.
And what it definitionally is opposed to Christianity. Not all of it, but lots of it.
Mm,
And he kept saying, but we don't have to accept that stuff. I'm like, you do if you take the critical race theorists themselves seriously. And the analogy I drew was, if I said to a Muslim, I think you worship, I think you believe in Jesus. And they would say, I do believe in Jesus. They do believe, Muslims believe in Jesus.
mm-hmm.
And I'd say, and I think you believe he's the Messiah. And I can affirm that. And they're like, yes, I do. I absolutely believe he's the Messiah. And you're like, and I think you think that he's God. And they would say, no, I don't. I was like, well, I think I do though. And I think I'm just going to take the stuff I like from your religion and I'm going to call myself a Muslim. I'm going to use Islam as a tool to understand things like Jesus Messiah. And like, but wait a minute. Like, but you want to deny a fundamental, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which is that there's one God and there's no helpers. And you want to deny that. And that's not Islam. And it's actually, I would argue, it's disrespectful to Islam to take pieces of their religion that you like and then claim that you're actually using their religion and embracing it and you're okay with it when they're like, you're not using it. We forbid you from calling yourself Muslim. You're not Muslim. In the same way, if a critical race theorist says it is non-negotiable that you are that you treat race, class, gender, sexuality all in the same way, you work for gay liberation along with racial liberation, along with that is non-negotiable. That is a core part of our theory. It has been from the beginning. And you say, I'd rather not. Then now you're. It's. I said to Ed, it's fine for you to say, I reject your theory, but I will use pieces of it that I can live with. That's okay.
Mm.
What you cannot say is that you're using the theory.
Right.
But
Yeah.
any more than I can say I'm using Islam, when I'm not using Islam, the Muslims would start screaming at me that I'm not using Islam. That's not respecting them.
Mm.
And you're not being consistent or really honest with how you're interacting with the theory. So I said to him, if you want to insist that we can take these parts and leave those parts, be my guest, but just don't call it critical race theory then.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, let's see if I can kind of formulate this, but it seems as though Ed is pointing more to personal relationships, and also like from a pastoral perspective, one-on-one with not academics or big thinkers on this topic. And so the people that he's interacting with aren't saying, I want to accept CRT necessarily, but
You're right.
they're thinking about it in terms of, intersectionality, social
Right.
justice. And so they're basically
Lingo
taking a
and
tenant
yes.
and saying, I agree with this. And I guess his point would be more like, well, they're not saying they're a critical race theorist.
Correct.
They're just saying, I agree with this one big, core tenet of it, which is
Right.
to your
I
point,
think
is
the problem there is that, yeah, so if I hear some person talking about white privilege, right, which is clearly it was coined by coined by Peggy McIntosh. She's not really a critical race theorist, but it's been folded into critical race theory since then. You can find books about it. But the bottom line is that someone talking about white privilege, and I don't immediately assume that they're going to affirm all of the core tenets of critical race theory. They probably have never even heard of critical race theory. So I'm not going to jump down their throats and say, this is CRT, it's awful, it's unbiblical. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk to them. But so I'm okay with Ed is right to say that some people do that. Some people hear the word white privilege and they jump down the person's throat, call them Marxist, break the relationship. When the poor guy heard that on the water cooler one day and just repeated it. I
and
get
it's
that.
everywhere.
Totally fine.
To be
And
fair,
it's
it's
everywhere,
everywhere.
right?
Yeah.
And frankly, there are some ways to think about white privilege that are not wrong. And now, if you really understand the theory, it is wrong. But there are ways to talk about, like, if you walk in, it's just if a white, we know there's data on this. If a white person applies for a job, they're more likely to get a call back than a black person, all things being equal. We know that. You can call that white privilege. That's you can say that's white privilege. Okay. Now the actual theory is way more than that, but okay, I get that. It's not crazy. What I would say though is that if you let people go on talking about white privilege and intersectionality and systemic racism, all these categories, not even fully understanding what they are, eventually those phrases and those ideas, if they keep embracing them and reading about them and talking about them, it's going to shape the way people think about everything. And this is what I have personally seen. Very solid evangelicals who have been justice-minded evangelicals and keep talking in these categories. This way, if you accept the premise that oppression is not just about violence and cruelty, oppression is also ideological. It's about how the ruling class, whites, imposes their values and culture, like they did under Jim Crow. Start thinking about oppression that way. You're like, oh yeah, it's kind of true. Like under Jim Crow and slavery, there were these ideologies and norms and values that were not really biblical. They were imposed by the white ruling class. Okay, that's reasonable. Then don't some of those exist today? I guess maybe they do a little bit, but they're kind of thinking, yeah, they really do. Yeah, that's right. We live in a white supremacist society still. And don't they create disparities? Yeah, all the disparities. And then are there other subjects or other issues, other categories where that kind of oppression operates, like gender? Are gender roles oppressive too? And there's subtle stereotypes like women can't do such and such, women aren't very smart, they're bad at reading direction. Oh yeah, I guess it's oppression too. Okay, what about the gender binary? But you're like, wait a minute, gender binary. But the point is they're being primed to think about all of reality now in the terms dictated by critical theory. And it often takes years to work itself out. But because these theories are coherent, they cohere, they go together. It's going to pull you into its orbit. It's like being near a big black hole. You can be kind of floating around the edges for a long time, but it's going to pull you closer and closer. And unless someone steps in and says, wait, do you know where this is leading? And what I have literally seen in the evangelical church is that it starts with this just very subtle and very, very naive and not at all pernicious desire to work for racial healing and unity, but then it begins to poison and color more and more of your outlook about everything until, suddenly you're LGBTQ affirming. So and it gets even, believe it or not, it can go worse than that. There are woke evangelicals who just apostatized because they came to see Christianity itself as a hegemonic discourse, and that God himself is an oppressor, and that they reject Christianity totally because it's based on moral hierarchy and these arbitrary social constructed norms. The point is that, I see what Ed's trying to do, but I think at this moment in where we are today in 2024, we need clarity as well as compassion. And we need people to understand what they're dabbling in. And I just think that Ed's approach, it muddies the question of whether these ideas are true and good. And it kind of,
No, I definitely agree. We've even seen it in our Reformed church, where it's not so much like, I don't see it so much in in regular discourse with regular people. I see a lot more with the academics who are trying to, I guess you would say, bridge the gap or like reach out to other academics in the world, like their secular counterparts, to, I guess, spark a discussion about these things where they're making, I can't say they're positively speaking about these issues, but like I've seen like blog posts from some academics in our community who say reviewed Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility and don't outright say this is bad, but try to find the
let's find the good in it.
Yeah, they can find the threads to say, okay, what can we learn from this? I am a white man, so what do you like? From your perspective, is that where the danger comes into the church? Or is it something more with this cultural pressure to the everyday lay people?
Well, it's both. It's that the cultural pressure is obviously there, but then we lack leaders who will identify the dangers. They tend to coddle them. So, there's nothing wrong. I don't know much good you can find in a White Fragility, frankly, but there's nothing wrong with taking some paper. I've done it. You can take an anthology of CRT writings and you can find ones that are, I thought, very insightful and helpful. In fact, I've said this before. If you read an anthology of CRT, I have tons back in my bookshelf. 20% of the writings are, I think, interesting. You're like, oh, this is really cool. Like, there's an essay about how Justice Harlan, I think his name is Justice Harlan. He wrote the minority, he opposed the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in the U.S. that instituted separate, basically supported segregation. He opposed it and said this is a bad decision. He was right. But there's an essay about how he had a black stepbrother, probably. We don't know, but it gave evidence for that. And they're like, that probably influenced his decision. I was like, oh, wow, that's fascinating. I actually asked a lawyer friend. He was like, yeah, it probably was the case. So I was like, wow, that's in a CRT anthology. So there are things like that where there's an essay about slave labor in the high-end garment industry in Los Angeles. It's fascinating. It's about how, these Asian immigrants get taken into slavery and then put into workshops to make high-end dresses in Los Angeles. And the CRT anthology, this is a fascinating article. 20% of articles are like that. 60% of the articles in these anthologies are, you're like, yeah, there's some stuff there. It's okay. And I can see the underlying problems though, but it's not overt. Then 20% are just off the wall insane, totally wrong. So clearly it is possible to, like you just did, to highlight the things that you agree with, right? But the danger is that you never say, and yet here's the fundamental problem with these views. You never get there. You're always trying to build bridges and trying to say, well, it's all bad and there's common grace there, but you never say clearly, but this is wrong. And I'm just being consistent here. Whenever there's a fundamentally wrong worldview or ideology, by all means, find common ground, especially if you're talking to a person who believes that stuff. But when you're also at some point say this is not compatible with the Bible
Mm,
for who they are, whether they're a fellow Christian, whether they're a non-Christian, because they need to hear that. And
mm.
especially for the church, we need to warn Christians: do not, there be dragons. This is not, you do not want to go here. To make it very clear, rather than singing them to sleep.
Yeah, yeah, and I felt that very dangerous with the way Ed views this, and I've seen this again in our churches. Just where an academic or a pastor will write something, especially when they write something, or if they post something online, that's consumed by, because a lot of these pastors have a following. People do pay attention to them,
Mm.
which is obviously good for like 99% of it. Um, but when Ed says things like, "Well, I think we can put this in front of some white people and have them discuss it, and maybe there is some good points to this book," where, and you give quotes. I think people should go watch this debate. It's
Yeah.
really interesting. You give quotes from not the things he cited in his book, but the same paper or the same books that he cited, where you have
Mm.
just these egregious statements of critical race theory, um, that I don't think Ed would agree with. But then to say, "Hey, look at this is something that maybe we want to discuss as Christians," I think there's an element that the people who do pay attention to these men who are writing, women who are writing, will take that to mean, "Oh, okay, I can now I can now interact with this piece of literature because
And
it
it's
was it
safe.
was
It's
kind
safe.
of endorsed." Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and not that they're not going to read it critically either, but there is an element of like it's just going to be a slippery slope. Like they're just going to say, "Okay, well, he said accept this piece, but I also kind of agree with this little other intersectionality because I have this experience that." And yeah, like you said, like if you don't at the beginning of the article or the beginning of your statement say this is wrong, um, however, maybe let's talk about it. I think, yeah, you end up in a dangerous spot for especially the people who are being led. Um,
Right. I mean,
Not
your job as
necessarily
a
the other
pastor or a
academics.
leader, like your job is discernment. I mean, it's
Mhm.
their job too, but as the leader, it falls mostly, or at least first, on your shoulders.
Mm.
And as a parent, for example, my kids should exercise discernment. Yes, they should. But the buck stops with me. I don't hand them a bowl of Skittles mixed with poison and say, there's some Skittles in here. Go for it. Like,
Yeah.
well, that's on me. Like, yeah, you're like, well, shouldn't they have known better? Yes, but also I
Mhm.
should have known better. So you
Yeah.
don't take a bowl full of half poison and half Skittles and hand them to your congregants and say, there's good stuff in here. You
Yeah.
say, hey, you do the hard work of picking out the Skittles, and then you give them the Skittles.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, I'm not saying don't train your congregation to have discernment. I'm just saying that you can't. It's almost disingenuous to say, "Well, I'm just sort of fostering discussions here." It's like, well, what if they go really bad? Maybe
Yeah.
you should not just foster discussions. Maybe you should actually put your foot down, but just make it clear where you think this is really unhelpful.
Hmm. So that actually kind of leads to this other question. I wanted to ask you because I don't think you had a chance to address this point that Ed made in this discussion. I was hoping that you would get the opportunity, but it didn't seem like you had the answer to or time to really answer it. Um, Ed, so he would agree with the assertion that the Christian church's reputation has been marred over history by basically an indifference to oppression. Um,
Mm.
and I found myself when he was describing that, thinking maybe we should, as a church, push back on um, this thought that the Christian church has just kind of rolled over on racism.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously bad examples, um, but I mean, I think there's probably good examples where the church has modeled what it's like to not oppress people. I mean, the one that comes to mind is the New Testament Christian church in the context of ancient Rome was probably
Yeah. Right.
for women especially was probably like a completely countercultural expression of what it was like to actually value women. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and you see some of that in Paul's letters instructing the church. What do you make of that? Do we have to just roll over as a Christian church and accept that we've done a poor job when it comes to these oppressed groups? And then, I mean, the reason why I ask this is kind of because Ed's assumption then is what we just talked about is now maybe we should just shut up.
Just
Maybe
listen. That's
maybe
right.
we should
Yeah.
just listen as white people. We have done a bad job. Let's just sit on the sidelines. And yeah, I mean, we can discuss whether or not that's even a good exercise in general, but what do you make of that assumption?
So yeah, it is heterogeneous. Obviously, I think it's fair to say the majority of, say, white churches did not push very hard against racism, right? And those are all qualified. Most very
Yeah.
hard, right? There's qualifications there, but I don't mind saying, yeah, okay, you go back and look at what people wrote in the 50s, the 1850s, you're going to find lots of bad stuff there. I'm fine with saying that. Um, and admitting that, being honest about that. But I think we'd also be naive to also not say explicitly, but people are using that truth as a cudgel to get you to accept very bad ideas. And that can't happen. So we have a whole chapter in our book talking about the history of race in the US and saying the Christian church did a bad job in many places of opposing slavery, opposing racism. Absolutely agreed. And yet, that does not then mean that you get to beat us over the heads with whatever stick you want. Currently, I mean, one point that people make, which people don't like hearing, but it's totally true, is that I did not own slaves. I am not even white. I'm half Indian. I'm half white. But this idea that I have to sit down and shut up now because you're because I don't even know why. Me personally, I'm white adjacent, I guess. But
You're half good,
that's
half
not a
bad.
bit.
That's it.
Yeah, right. I will follow James's injunction to be slow to speak, quick to listen. We all should. If you want to talk, and that's fine. I'll listen. I'll genuinely listen. I'll hear your concern. I'll try to understand them. But at the end of the day, we both have to sit under the authority of Scripture. Period. And I think Ed sees the danger of apathy as so great that we need to really hammer the whole sit and listen point. And again, I would almost say, agree. What I am going to demand, though, is it can't be an only listen posture. It cannot be, because there are false teachers who come in all shades. And if I am not allowed to question false teachers because they are Black or because they're women or because whatever, that's bad. And that's where I will give to Ed, I will concede to him all of the framing he wants about how terrible the Christian church's response has been as a whole to all these issues. Yes, I will concede that therefore we should listen, even though I'm half Indian. Okay. we really have to just bend over backwards to listen. Okay, got it. But will you concede then at the end of the day, if I hear false teaching, that I am actually required, if I'm an elder, for example, to speak up and say that's false? And that you cannot then, but you're a white male. I'm sorry, I'm an elder of the church, and this is my God-ordained responsibility to keep this teaching out. That's where I would just dig in and say, if you say no to that, you have to take it up with God, because God's the one who said that elders are to shepherd the flock. And that's what I think is happening, is that, and I'd insist that in his experience, 99% of the time, the white people that he meets, whatever he says, 90% of the time, the white people that he meets are just too apathetic.
Right.
They're too apathetic to racial issues. Okay, granted. But even they need to have the freedom to call out false teaching. And I think that is where we have to be non-negotiably united in saying, that's right, that's God's principles, not ours. And we can't allow people to twist our arm to get us to feel bad enough to let them have a pass.
Right.
Which does happen too.
And I think, I completely agree. I think that's where, if you don't adopt this posture of, this is wrong to start with, you get led along the garden path of accepting slowly,
right.
Especially in a conversation where you're talking with somebody who admittedly you don't understand their, lived experience.
Sure.
And they do express, real issues that, maybe come from a real painful place, even inside the church, which is, it's a hard thing to deal with in person, let alone if they're knowingly or unknowingly pushing some of these ideologies. So there's kind of two questions that come to mind about that, and then we should probably wrap it up at some point. But I got a chance to talk with Neil Shenvi. I don't want to let you go too quick. So one is the idea of the woke right, but maybe we can leave that for a second. You mentioned before the we know that there's disparity in our culture, and you use the example often of white and black applicants who are
Yeah.
um, put up against each other in every measurable way, like even
Hmm.
attractiveness, I think.
That's right. Yeah.
So how much of this, look, I'm not trying to like dumb down racism at all in our culture, but I'm trying to say like how much of this pushback that we're seeing is because people recognize that this is bad, um, and therefore see a problem with, or a potential problem with, people in these groups. Like it's almost that like critical theorists are pushing an ideology in order to liberate people, and in so doing, identifying for people in culture who are, quote unquote oppressors, who maybe will be the problem, um, or who will maybe have adopted this ideology that no one feels qualified in culture to address. Like, if you know what I'm saying, it's a
You're
hard
saying
thing to.
that the critical theory is just reversing the oppress. Like basically, you're oppressing the white people now and
Well,
making
there
them
is
the
that,
norm.
and I mean that kind of speaks to the woke right thing a little
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah.
but then also like it is a bit of this anti-racist thing, but then
Mm.
people are avoiding that. So whether it's whites and colored people of color, or if it's a gender thing or anything, people just kind of want to steer away at all costs, because there's not really like, with the interview, there's not really a cost to somebody to not call the black applicant, right? There's no, um there's social pressure to do that, but there's also
Mm.
no real cost to somebody to say, well, let's just pretend that we had a better white applicant. Um,
Mm.
and so like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know exactly how to say it, but is there that pressure, that's actually kind of like working counter to this whole movement?
So I'm not sure I quite understand your question. I think there is a um, a reactionary movement against the DEI stuff. There's a book I actually just started reading called "The Unprotected Class" by Jeremy Carl. I think Jeremy Carl, basically arguing that whites are the basically becoming the victim group of all these DEI initiatives. So you'll see occasionally these pictures that are captioned like, "Wow, what a diverse cast," and it'll
Mm,
be all
yeah.
blacks and Latinos. And you're like, but there's no white people.
Right.
How's
Yeah.
that diverse? Because diverse is a synonym for like no whites,
Yeah.
which is that's a fair criticism, right? What do you mean by diversity? Do you really mean diversity, or just like no white people, and no men, or no straight people? So that's fair to question that. And the other obvious thing is ideological diversity. If you have lots of different colors of people, but they're all progressives, then you have one kind of diversity, but not the ideological diversity that actually is probably pretty helpful. Actually, there's studies on this. The ideological diversity actually leads to say better science. So I think, but what I would just say is with these studies of like discrimination, racial discrimination, there are a lot of factors that go into those, and they're hard to probe. So
Mm,
those studies, for example, don't show that the HR people, the hiring people, are actually racially biased. They could just be unconsciously just reacting to people's names or making assumptions without any animosity.
yeah.
But I always point out those that, well, but if you're the black applicant, it doesn't really matter why you got turned down, right? It just matters
Mm,
that you got turned down.
yeah.
So it's fair to say, even if it's completely, unconscious, it still hurts people's chances, and they're still right to say this is unfair. And I think institutionally, we can say, well, how can we ameliorate that? How can we fix the problem, even though it's not malicious? And then and the other side of that is, of course, there's quote unquote reverse racism, which is just racism against whites in some places. My friend Pat's experienced that, where he's an old white man and he's been
Mm,
treated badly because he's an old white man with a southern accent. So it goes both ways. So I think the biblical perspective is that we should reject the whole prejudice plus power definition of racism, which is only whites can be racist and people of color can't be racist. Wrong. Anybody can be racist because racism is a sin, and anyone can commit sin. And then we should push against both kinds of racism. And even when it comes to like just stereotypes, unconscious bias, these things can exist. I think we should be careful though not to just assume that It's everywhere. It's just pernicious. We have to spend 40 hours a week doing bias training.
Right.
There's a cost to that too, right? In
Mm.
terms of just lost hours of productivity. And I'm also
Yeah.
trying to find, there's a great book actually I have here by Helen Pluckrose. She's an atheist, but she wrote a book called The Counterweight Handbook.
Mm.
And it's written for secular people. It's how to push back against wokeness in your workplace, basically.
Right.
And
Yeah.
she points out that these studies show that a lot of this stuff is not only is it a waste of time, it's harmful. It's actually making people more racist. so
Right.
so um, there's lots of reasons to oppose that kind of stuff. And you want to talk quickly about the right-wing woke stuff? I can touch on that briefly.
Yeah, we see this all the time in Canada, by the way. This DEI thing is a huge move. I mean, from Trudeau and stuff. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the right woke thing quickly because I think this is probably this is one of the dangers that I think the church might run into, especially like culturally, white churches.
Right.
Can you just describe that really quickly? I mean, I think just a description of it will help us, shield ourselves to it a little bit.
Basically, I've seen a phenomenon emerging on Twitter of conservative evangelicals embracing a mirror image version of wokeness, and I go point by point through the social binary, hegemonic power, lived experience, and social justice, and describe this movement I call the woke right, that are basically taking all the premises of critical theory and just inverting them, so that now society is divided into oppressors and victims and victimizers, but the victims are the straight white males. And the oppressors are, this hegemonic system. The progressive left is oppressing straight white males, and not overtly, interestingly, because they'll even admit, well, frankly, they're way more straight white males in government, as CEOs. They own everything, so they can't really legitimately say, if you look around, people with actual power are all black lesbians. That's just not true. But they have the DEI, the hegemonic power of the DEI industry is victimizing us. And then,
right.
And we can see that. So we have to, get red pilled, but we have to sort of wake up to realize that we're actually victims of what they call the post-war consensus, or Judeo-Christianity, which is the fusion of Judaism and Christianity that they don't like. And then we have to work basically for revolution, maybe not violent per se, but we have to overturn the system, which is against our heritage. So I really do think it's a point-by-point mirror image of wokeness, and it's clearly reactionary. I mean, I don't think, of course, there have always been people who are just racist. They've been around. But in the last 5 years, I think people have reacted against DEI and all Black Lives Matter and just said, we're done. We're done letting you trample all over us. They see the actual unfairness of a lot of these things, and they're right. But then their solution is not to come back to what the Bible would say about these things. Their solution is to counteract all that stuff by going too far the other way.
Like an anti-racism.
That's exactly right. The funny thing is too, it's not just in terms of their ideas, it's their tactics. They will invoke the same fallacious reasoning as the woke left, where they will impugn your motives. They'll say, you claim to want X, but really the reason you're doing that is because these subtle power dynamics and the hegemonic norms, they'll see through your motives. And I'm like, man, the funny thing, I'm like, I opposed all these woke left ideas because of the Bible. But don't you see that if that's why you oppose these woke left ideas, you'll oppose the same ideas on the right? It doesn't matter whose ideas they are. They're just bad ideas. So what I would just, again, say is that if you accept my critique of these ideas when the progressives use them, good. But you should equally oppose those ideas when the call them what you want, not really conservatives, maybe the radicals on the right, the reactionaries. When they use them, you should also say these are still bad ideas.
Yeah, it's just a temptation just to be fed up, right? You're like,
right.
Okay, I see this all over the place, and then just to be angry with it, or just to say, even as Christians, just to say, we just need to abolish this, and then just going about it the wrong way. And that's why I when I was listening to some of your stuff talking about this and reading that article you've got on your website, I've encouraged people, again, go there and listen to it. We'll link all that stuff. Just the temptation is there for Christians, especially because you're already on the right, swing too far in reaction to some of the stuff out of anger for obviously horrific things that you're seeing in culture. So,
Mm.
no, I appreciate that. The clarity with which you speak about this stuff is doesn't cease to amaze me. It's unreal. I appreciate all your work.
Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to add? Otherwise, I think
No,
that
that's I
covers
gotta
most
watch
of
my kids. They're banging at the door. So thank you,
it.
Tyler,
100%.
for inviting me at a great time talking.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shenvi. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Just a quick shout out to our sponsor for this episode, Redeemer University. You could check them out at redeemer.ca. Thanks to them for making this episode possible. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. In partnership with Reform Perspective, this show is created and produced by Tyler Vanderwood, Lucas Holtfleur, and Mariah Tamiga. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you have any feedback for us or ideas for future guests or topics, please let us know. You can reach us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. Be sure to also follow us on social media. You can search Reformed Real Talk on any of the platforms. We should come right up. Also, leave us a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast platforms. That would be greatly appreciated. That's all for now, folks. Keep having real talk.